When the boil water advisory scrolled across the bottom of the local news feed, I didn't bother calling the municipal hotline. I just grabbed my keys. I knew exactly which station had tripped. I knew it because I was the one standing on that same concrete floor in the autumn of 1979, holding a clipboard and watching the pressure gauges dance during the initial stress test validation. That pump house isn't just a dot on a grid to me. It's a chapter of my life. I walked past the security gate because the guard was too busy watching the panic on his phone to notice an old man in a faded work jacket carrying a heavy steel box. Inside, the scene was exactly what I expected. A cluster of consultants in clean, pressed polo shirts were standing in a circle around the number 4 unit. They looked like surgeons trying to figure out why a patient died, except they were afraid to touch the body. Their $50,000 diagnostic rig was hooked up to the control panel, flashing a big red banner that read, "Critical Impeller Shear." To them, that screen was the gospel. They were preparing to sign the death warrant for $12 million of functional engineering based on a sensor panic. They saw a catastrophic failure. I saw a machine that was being misunderstood. They were letting the computer guess, but I was there to let the metal speak. The air inside the pump house was thick enough to chew on. 4 days of stagnation had pushed the humidity up to 85%, and the smell of ozone and damp concrete filled the cavernous space. It was quiet. Too quiet. The deep, rhythmic thrum that should have been shaking the floorboards was gone, replaced by the high-pitched whine of cooling fans on the server racks. In the center of it all sat the accused, a 1978 Ingersoll-Rand centrifugal pump. It's a beast of a machine, a 3,086-pound cast iron housing rated for 5,000 gallons per minute. It wasn't built to be pretty. It was built to move rivers. But right now, it was just a silent, cold lump of metal. The lead consultant, a man who looked like he'd never had grease under his fingernails in his life, was tapping away at a tablet. "Internal impeller shear," he announced, reading the machine's death sentence. "Rollover torque snapped the vanes. Shaft misaligned. Total loss." The project manager, a young guy who clearly trusted his iPad more than his own eyes, nodded solemnly. "It's tragic, but the data is conclusive. We have to scrap it." He was already pulling up the purchase order for a German replacement. $2.4 million, with an 18-week lead time. 18 weeks meant the hospital running on reserves, the nursing home evacuating, and half the county rationing water until the snow fell. That's when I set my Kennedy tool chest down on the concrete. The sound of heavy steel hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot in that quiet room. The project manager spun around, annoyed. He looked at the battered red chest, then at me. "Who are you?" he asked. "This is a restricted site." "I'm the guy who signed off on this pump's commissioning 45 years ago," I said, my voice echoing off the tiled walls. "And I'm telling you that pump isn't dead. It's just confused." He laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. "We have a team of certified engineers here, sir. We have diagnostic equipment worth more than your truck. And you think you can fix a sheared impeller with—" He gestured at my tool chest. "With museum pieces?" "I don't think," I said. "I know." He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Look, I don't know how you got in here, but we don't have time for a retired hobbyist to play hero. This is a digital failure mode. The shaft is gone. The physics don't lie." "You're right," I said. "Physics don't lie. But sensors do." He demanded my credentials. He wanted to see a badge, a certification, something that fit into his digital world. I didn't hand him a card. I just looked him in the eye and told him I was testing hydraulic tolerance on this line while he was still learning object permanence. He sneered, calling security on his radio. He was ready to throw me out, ready to let that town go dry because his screen told him it was the only option. He called me a relic. He said my time had passed. I refused to even glance at the diagnostic tablet the project manager was waving in my face. In my line of work, that screen is just a distraction. It's an interpretation of reality, not reality itself. Instead, I walked right past him and placed my palm flat against the massive cast iron casing of the pump. The metal was sweating. Condensation from the humid air had slicked the surface, but underneath the moisture, the iron was trying to tell me a story. You have to understand, when a 3,000-pound pump actually shears an impeller, when the internal geometry violently disintegrates, it doesn't whisper. It screams. It shakes the foundation. It feels like a bag of hammers in a washing machine. But as I closed my eyes and focused on the tactile feedback vibrating through my calluses, I didn't feel chaos. I felt a rhythm. It was a high-frequency chatter, vibrating at roughly 47 hertz, the specific rhythm of fluid struggling, not metal breaking. The consultants looked at me like I was speaking Aramaic. They were engineers of the digital age. If it wasn't in the code, it didn't exist. I reached into my chest for the only tool that could verify what my hands were feeling. I pulled out my stethoscope. It wasn't a doctor's instrument. It was a 2-foot length of heavy-duty rubber fuel line hose jammed into the end of a tin funnel. It looked like garbage. It listened like a spy. I pressed the funnel against the bearing housing, blocking out the ambient hum of the facility. Silence. Well, not silence, but the smooth, oily whir of a healthy bearing. If that shaft was misaligned by even a fraction of an inch, the bearings would be grinding. They would sound like gravel being crushed. Instead, they were singing. I moved the hose to the volute casing, listening to the water itself. If you had a shear, I said, narrating for the room, I would hear cavitation. I would hear the water tearing itself apart in a vacuum. But I don't. I hear compression pulses, rhythmic, strong. That impeller is pushing water, not chopping salad. I moved my hand along the casing again, this time checking the thermal profile. The intake neck was cold, exactly the temperature of the reservoir water. The main compression chamber was warm, expected friction. But then I slid my hand up to the bypass valve, a small, often ignored loop of piping near the discharge. It was hot. Not warm. Hot. It was radiating a sharp, localized heat that shouldn't be there. That third heat point was the smoking gun. You don't get heat like that from a broken shaft. You get that kind of heat when high-pressure water is being forced through a restriction that has become too tight. I wiped the grease from my hand onto my jeans and turned to face the project manager. "You're ready to spend $2 million because you think this pump is broken," I said. "It isn't broken. It's choking. This machine has a birth defect. It's a flaw that has been hiding inside this casing for 45 years, just waiting for a day exactly this hot and this humid to finally wake up. To understand why this pump is screaming, you have to go back to a rainy afternoon in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in November of 1978. I know this because I didn't just install these units, I memorized their birth certificates. I reviewed the original production logs from the foundry when we commissioned this station. This specific pump wasn't just any build. It was part of Lot 44B. It was fabricated on the Friday shift, right before the Thanksgiving break. In the manufacturing world, we call that the Friday afternoon special. The foreman is looking at the clock, the machinists are thinking about the drive home, and quality control is, let's say, optimistic. On that specific Friday, the subcontractor supplying the check valve assemblies ran out of the specified material. The blueprints, the ones these consultants have never looked at, called for CDA-26000 cartridge brass. It's a stable 70-30 copper-zinc alloy that doesn't care if it's hot or cold. It stays dimensionally true. But at 3 p.m. on a Friday in 1978, with a quota to fill, someone on the line made a substitution. They grabbed a crate of lower-grade commercial brass. It looked the same. It machined the same. It fit the hole. But it had a higher zinc content. That substitution is the ghost in this machine. See, high zinc brass has a nasty little habit that modern engineering software doesn't account for. It's hygroscopic and thermally reactive in a way that standard cartridge brass isn't. Under normal conditions, it works fine. That's why this pump ran for 45 years without a hiccup. But today isn't normal. We have 85% ambient humidity and a pump casing temperature pushing past 140 degrees Fahrenheit due to the friction of the stagnant water. When you heat that cheap, high-zinc alloy to this specific temperature in this specific humidity, it doesn't just get hot, it blooms. It undergoes a microscopic thermal expansion, swelling exactly 0.03 of an inch beyond its specification. 0.03 of an inch. That's the thickness of a human hair. To the project manager holding the tablet, that number is a rounding error. To a hydraulic system operating at high pressure, it's a brick wall. That microscopic swelling has caused the shim stack in the bypass check valve to warp. It's bowing convex, just slightly. This warping creates a tiny gap, a leak path that shouldn't exist. High-pressure water is jetting through that gap, and because the space is so tight, the water is flashing into vapor. That's the physics of it. It's creating a continuous stream of collapsing vacuum bubbles right next to the impeller. When those bubbles collapse, they create a shock wave. Your $50,000 computer feels that shock wave. It feels the violent vibration of those bubbles imploding, and it searches its database for a match. It finds high-frequency impact and vibration spike, and it concludes the only logical thing it was programmed to understand: impeller shear. It thinks the metal is breaking because it can't comprehend that the metal is just breathing wrong. This specific defect was never written down in a service bulletin. You won't find it on Google. It exists only in the memories of the men who stood on that assembly line in 1978, and in the handwritten notes I took in 1979. That is a fascinating theory, the project manager said, his voice dripping with that specific brand of corporate condescension that usually costs the taxpayers $200 an hour. But theories don't pump water, Mr. Holland. We have a solution approved and ready to order. You are suggesting we delay a critical infrastructure project based on a hunch about a 40-year-old shim. He checked the expensive smartwatch on his wrist. I'll tell you what. Since you are so confident that you know more than the sensors, let's make this interesting. I want you off my site, but I want you to leave knowing you're wrong. He pointed a manicured finger at the setting sun, visible through the high, clear-story windows of the pump house. You have until sunset. That gives you exactly 4 hours. If you can restore this unit to its rated 5,000 gallons per minute capacity without replacing the impeller, you win. But if you fail, or if that vibration doesn't vanish, you leave immediately, and you leave that behind. He pointed at my Kennedy tool chest. The room went dead silent. That chest is a 7-drawer roller cabinet made of heavy-gauge steel. It's covered in stickers from unions that don't exist anymore. It contains 3 generations of hand tools, stare-at micrometers, snap-on wrenches from the 60s, files that cut true after decades of use. It wasn't just a box of metal. It was my career. It was my father's career. He was asking me to bet my history against his software. And if I fix it? I asked, my voice low and steady. If you fix it, he scoffed, I will personally cancel the $2.4 million purchase order for the German unit. And I will authorize you to invoice us for your time at your standard consulting rate. Not that I have any fear of that happening. He turned to the room, looking for validation. Witnesses? The water department supervisor, a guy named Miller who I'd trained on centrifugal alignment back in the 90s, stepped forward. I'm witnessing, Miller said, crossing his arms. And we have Councilman Davis and Councilwoman Ortiz on the video link. They heard it. I looked at the pump. I looked at the dark water lines running out to the city. I didn't care about the money. I didn't even really care about proving him wrong. I cared about the murder. Scrapping this machine because you were too lazy to understand it was a sin. It was a waste of good iron. Deal, I said. I walked over to my chest and unlocked the drawers. The sound of the tumblers clicking open was the only noise in the facility. I didn't rush. Rushing is for people who don't know what they're doing. I laid out a shop rag on the concrete. I pulled out my tools with deliberate, ritualistic precision. The half-inch drive ratchet, the breaker bar, the set of punch drifts, the vintage stare-at micrometer in its wooden case. I lined them up like surgical instruments. I could feel the eyes on my back. The consultants were smirking, waiting for the old man to fail. The city workers were praying I wouldn't. I turned to the project manager one last time. You might want to step back, I said, picking up the breaker bar. Your computer is looking for a corpse. I'm about to wake the patient up. I didn't walk toward the massive electric motor, and I didn't walk toward the main impeller housing. That confused them immediately. The diagnostic screen was screaming about a sheared impeller shaft, which is located at the front of the assembly, but I was walking toward the back, to the dark, dusty corner where the bypass manifold snakes out of the main discharge line. To the consultants, this was like watching a heart surgeon start operating on the patient's foot. I could hear the project manager whispering to his team, probably making a joke about senility, but I tuned him out. I had a job to do. I knelt on the cold grating and inspected the bypass check valve housing. It was a heavy cast iron bell secured by 16 bolts that looked like they hadn't been touched since the Carter administration. The paint on the bolt heads was unbroken. That told me everything I needed to know. In 45 years of maintenance logs, through 3 overhauls and a dozen inspections, no one had ever cracked this seal. Why would they? The sensors always reported valve open. The computer said it was fine, so the mechanics left it alone. They trusted the green light on the dashboard more than the physics of the system. I grabbed my breaker bar, a 24-inch chrome lever that multiplies force, and fitted a heavy-duty socket. I didn't use an impact gun. Impact guns are for speed. Hands are for feeling. I needed to feel how the threads released. I leaned my weight into the first bolt. It fought me for a second, the rust holding on with a grim determination. And then, crack. A sharp, dry snap echoed through the pump house. It wasn't the sound of a bolt breaking. It was the sound of a seal surrendering. "He's wasting time," I heard the project manager say, louder this time. "The vibration is coming from the main shaft. He's stripping a valve that has nothing to do with the failure." I ignored him and moved to the next bolt. Crack. Then the next. Crack. It took me 20 minutes of sweat and leverage to free all 16. My shoulders burned, a familiar ache that felt like an old friend. When the last bolt came free, I tapped the housing with a brass hammer to break the gasket seal. Dark, stagnant water wept out of the seam, smelling of iron and old mud. I lifted the heavy cover and set it aside, exposing the heart of the bypass system, the check valve cartridge. I reached in and pulled the cartridge out. It was a heavy brass assembly, dripping wet. To the untrained eye, it looked perfect. The spring was intact. The seat was clean. But I wasn't looking at the big parts. I was looking at the shim stack, the series of thin brass wafers that determine exactly how far the valve can travel. I carried the dripping assembly over to my tool chest and set it down on a clean rag. I wiped the grease from the shim stack and picked up my micrometer. This isn't a digital caliper that gives you a quick number. This is a vintage Starrett analog micrometer. It relies on the feel of the ratchet stop against the metal. It doesn't lie, and it doesn't run out of batteries. I isolated the primary spacing shim. The factory specification for this unit, the number printed in the manual these guys had on their tablets, calls for a thickness of 0.091 inches. That is the magic number. At that thickness, the valve opens fully. I placed the shim between the anvils of the micrometer and gently turned the thimble until it clicked. I held it up to the light, squinting at the vernier scale. "Come here," I said to the project manager. I didn't ask. I ordered. He walked over, his arms crossed, looking bored. "What am I looking at?" "Read the scale," I said. He leaned in, squinting. 0.094. 0.094, I repeated. 0.03 of an inch too thick. He shrugged. "So? It's 0.03 of an inch. That's within casting tolerance. It doesn't explain a catastrophic impeller shear." "It explains everything," I said, handing him the shim. "Look at the surface. See that white powdery residue in the corner? That's zinc bloom. This isn't the alloy you think it is. This is the cheap stuff from the Friday build." I took the shim back and held it up. "Here's the physics lesson you missed in school. When this high zinc alloy gets hot, like it is right now, it doesn't just expand, it warps. It bows out in the middle, turning convex. It essentially becomes a spring." I grabbed an air nozzle connected to the shop's compressor line. I placed the warped shim back onto the valve seat and pressed it down with my thumb, simulating the hydraulic pressure. "Watch." I triggered the air. Instead of sealing tight, the shim fluttered. The air shrieked through the tiny gap created by the warp. "You hear that?" I asked. "That's the sound of high-pressure water flashing into vapor as it squeezes through a gap that shouldn't be there. It creates a vacuum pocket that collapses 10,000 times a second. That collapse creates a shock wave. Your sensors felt that shock wave and thought the impeller was shaking itself to death. But the impeller is fine. The pump is just trying to breathe through a straw that's pinched shut." The room was silent. The project manager looked at the shim, then at the diagnostic screen, then back at the shim. The math was starting to hit him. So, we need to order a new shim stack? He asked, his voice losing some of its edge. The lead time on parts for a 1978 unit is... We don't order anything, I said, reaching into my chest and pulling out a 12-inch mill file. We fix it. I'm going to file this down by hand. I'm going to take exactly 3/1000ths of an inch off this face, and I'm going to do it so perfectly flat that a light beam won't pass under it. And when I put it back in, your red warning light is going to turn green. I held the mill file up to the light, inspecting the diagonal cutting teeth. It was a 12-inch bastard cut file, made of high-carbon steel, with a handle of worn hickory that had absorbed the sweat of 40 years of labor. To the consultants, it looked like a primitive stick. To me, it was a precision instrument capable of removing material in increments smaller than a human blood cell, provided you had the hands to control it. I clamped the brass shim into the small portable vise mounted on the side of my tool chest. I didn't tighten it enough to mar the surface, just enough to hold it steady against the bite of the file. The project manager was hovering over my shoulder now, watching with a mixture of skepticism and morbid curiosity. He had probably never seen metal worked by hand. In his world, parts came in plastic bags with barcodes. You didn't modify them, you replaced them. You don't just scrub back and forth, I said, positioning the file. Brass is soft, it's seductive. If you get aggressive, it will grab the file and gouge deep. You have to float the tool. I took my first pass. Long, deliberate strokes. Shh, shh, shh. The sound was dry and rhythmic. Fine brass dust, like gold flour, began to sprinkle onto the shop rag below. I wasn't just removing height, I was correcting the surface geometry. I did 3 passes, then stopped. I picked up the micrometer. 0.093. 1/1000th removed. Why not use a grinder? The project manager asked. You'd be done in 10 seconds. A grinder introduces heat, I said, not looking up. Heat changes the temper of the metal, and a grinder has no soul. It takes what it wants. A file only takes what you give it. 3 more strokes. Shh, shh, shh. I wiped the surface with my thumb to feel for burrs. It was smooth as glass. I measured again. 0.092. We were getting close to the bone. I needed exactly 0.091, but I was aiming for a tolerance of 5/10,000ths of an inch. I took 2 final feather-light passes. The metal felt different under the file now. That subtle, tactile shift that tells you you've hit the true surface. I clicked the micrometer shut. 0.091 on the nose. Now for the real test, I said. I pulled a small propane torch from my chest and clicked the igniter. The blue flame hissed. The consultants took a step back, alarmed. I held the corrected shim in a pair of pliers and passed it through the flame, bringing it up to about 200 degrees, well past the operating temperature of the pump. I set it down on the flat anvil of the vise. Look! Before, the heat would have made the shim bow up like a frightened cat. Now, it lay dead flat. The correction had removed the internal stress layer. The ghost was gone. It's not warping, the project manager whispered. He sounded almost disappointed that physics was actually working. Let's put it back together, I said. I slid the shim back into the check valve cartridge and seated the assembly into the heavy cast iron housing. Then came the bolts. I threaded them in by hand, spinning them down until they were finger tight. Then I reached for my torque wrench. Check your manual, I told the project manager. What's the torque spec for the bypass housing cover? He tapped on his tablet. 38 foot-pounds. Wrong, I said, setting the dial on my wrench. That is the generic specification for a grade 5 bolt of this diameter. But if you look at the head of these bolts, you'll see 6 radial lines. These are grade 8 hardened alloy steel. And because we are compressing a gasket that has been crushed before, we need to account for the lack of rebound. I set the wrench to 45 foot-pounds. If I torque this to 38 like your iPad says, it will hold for an hour. Then, as the system heats up, the gasket will relax, the seal will weep, and you'll lose prime. You have to torque for the metal you have, not the metal the book thinks you have. I tightened the bolts in a star pattern. Click, click, click. The sound was solid. The housing was sealed. I walked over to the manual priming pump, a lever on the side of the casing that most modern technicians don't even know exists. I started pumping. It took 10 strokes before I heard it. The deep, gurgling glug, glug, glug of water displacing air. The sound of the pump lungs filling up. "Clear the codes," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Reset your flow meters. It's time to wake her up." I walked over to the main control panel, the heavy steel cabinet that houses the brains of the station. The digital display was still throwing a tantrum. It showed a big red padlock icon and the words, "System locked. Critical failure imminent." The computer was trying to protect the machine from itself, refusing to send power to the motor because its sensors were still terrified of that phantom vibration. The project manager stepped forward, looking like he was about to tackle me. "You can't start it," he said, his voice pitching up a notch. "The safety interlocks are engaged. The software won't allow a start sequence with active fault codes. You need an admin password to override that, and I'm not giving it to you." "I don't need a password," I said, reaching past him. "I need a thumb." I flipped up the dusty plastic safety cover on the far right side of the board, revealing a large, red, analog button labeled Emergency Manual Obafor. It's a hardwired bypass switch required by federal law for disaster scenarios, a direct line to the magnetic contactors that ignores the silicon brain entirely. Modern operators are terrified of this button. They treat it like a self-destruct mechanism. To me, it's just the truth switch. "If you press that," the project manager warned, "and that shaft is sheared, you're going to send shrapnel through the casing. You'll destroy the facility." "Stand back," I said. I pressed the button. There was a split second of silence, followed by the heavy clack, clack, clack of the massive magnetic contactors slamming shut inside the cabinet. Then came the groan. It's a sound you feel in your teeth. 4,160 volts hitting a stationary electric motor. The lights in the pump house dimmed for a heartbeat as the grid took the load. The motor strained against the static head pressure, fighting the weight of thousands of gallons of water sitting dead in the pipe. For 3 seconds, it sounded like a dying wail. The consultants flinched. The project manager closed his eyes, waiting for the explosion. Then, the groan smoothed out. The pitch shifted. It climbed from a low growl to a steady, deep, rhythmic thrum. It settled exactly at 60 hertz. That is the specific operational tone of a healthy Ingersoll-Rand unit. It wasn't screaming. It wasn't shaking. It was humming. It was the sound of $12 million of machinery doing exactly what it was born to do. I walked over to the analog flow gauges, the big dial indicators on the wall that don't need a software update to work. The needle was trembling at the bottom. Then it caught. 1,000 gallons per minute, I called out over the roar of the motor. The needle swept upward, smooth and steady. 3,000! The floor beneath our feet was vibrating, but it was the good kind of vibration. The low-frequency rumble of power, not the high-frequency chatter of failure. I placed my hand on the pump casing, right where the bypass valve sat. The heat was gone. The water was flowing through the corrected shim gap, cooling the metal, doing its job. 4,500! The needle settled firmly at 5,500 gallons per minute. Sustained output. "Look at your tablet," I shouted to the project manager. He opened his eyes and looked down. The screen had stopped flashing red. One by one, the error codes were flickering out. Critical impeller shear. Resolved. Vibration sensor 4. Nominal. Hydraulic thermal spike. Normal. The red banner vanished, replaced by a boring, beautiful green bar that simply read, "System online." The silence from the consulting team was louder than the pump. They were staring at the data stream, trying to reconcile their digital reality with the physical miracle happening in front of them. The project manager looked at the pump, then at me, then at the 5-cent shim I had left on the workbench. His face went pale. He wasn't just realizing the pump was fixed. He was doing the math. He was realizing that he had almost authorized a $2.4 million expenditure and an 18-week crisis for a problem that was solved with a file and a propane torch. The radio on his belt crackled. It was the municipal engineer at the treatment plant down the line. "Station 4, this is Central. We are seeing full flow restoration. Turbidity is 0. Pressure is nominal. You guys work a miracle down there?" The project manager didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at the spinning shaft, listening to the metal hum a tune he hadn't believed in 10 minutes ago. I didn't wait for the applause, because there wasn't going to be any. I walked back to my tool chest and wiped down my mill file with an oiled rag before putting it back in its designated slot. I closed the drawers, locked the chest, and pulled a crumpled notepad from my back pocket. I scribbled the invoice in pencil. Labor, 4 hours. Parts, 1 brass shim, refurbished. Total, $847. I tore the page out and handed it to the project manager. He was still standing by the control panel, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. "About that consultation fee," he started, his voice quiet. "The $2.4 million. We can work out a retainer." "Keep it," I said, snapping the locks on my chest. "I don't want your retainer, and I don't want to be a consultant. I just want you to stop treating these machines like disposable appliances." I dragged my chest toward the heavy steel doors. The sun was setting now, casting long orange beams across the pump house floor, hitting the green paint of the Ingersoll-Rand unit. "This pump isn't scrap," I said, stopping in the doorway. "It's got another 20 years in it, easy. But only if you teach your guys to listen to it. Stop looking at the screen and start putting your hands on the metal. The data is just a guess. The metal never lies." I pushed the doors open and walked out into the cool evening air. The boil water advisory would be lifted by morning. The town would drink. And somewhere, in a server room, a computer would log a successful repair, never knowing that it had been outsmarted by a ghost with a file. Keep your ears open and your calipers ready. The computer is guessing, but the metal knows.